The fall. Nobody who passed him at dusk would have guessed the truth. The man hunched against the alley wall had once signed contracts worth $50 million from a corner office lined with marble. Marcus Sullivan's hands cupped a styrofoam cup more out of habit than warmth. The coffee inside was cold, but the motion made him feel not quite invisible. The skyline behind him glowed with the same amber light that used to fill his floor-to-ceiling windows, a view he'd once measured success by, and now those towers watched him like indifferent judges. He tightened the thrift store jacket he'd found in a dumpster and listened to the city breathe. Every polished lobby, every chauffeured car he passed was a mirror that reflected a stranger wearing his name. There was no melodrama in his collapse, only one catastrophic choice that had detonated everything he'd built and reduced the world he knew to an errand of survival. Find shelter, find food, keep the small dignity of waking up another day. Before we start the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That was 3 years ago. Now, the same city felt like a maze designed specifically to remind him of everything he'd lost. Every street corner held a memory. Every building whispered accusations. The gleaming towers where he once commanded respect now loomed over him like judges passing sentence, their glass facades reflecting a version of himself he barely recognized. Marcus pulled his torn jacket tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't even his jacket. He'd found it in a dumpster behind a dry cleaner 2 months ago, still wrapped in plastic, forgotten by some customer who never came back. The irony wasn't lost on him. He used to have a walk-in closet full of Tom Ford suits, each one worth more than most people's monthly rent. Now he wore someone else's discarded outerwear and considered himself lucky. A woman in a designer coat hurried past, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. Click, click, click. Danger. 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 She didn't look at him. Nobody ever did, not really. Their eyes would slide past him like he was part of the scenery, another piece of urban decay they'd learned to mentally erase from their field of vision. He wondered what she did for a living. Marketing executive, maybe. Or finance. Someone who worked in one of those buildings he used to own meetings in, where decisions worth millions were made over catered lunches and PowerPoint presentations. Someone who had everything he'd lost and didn't even know how fragile it all was. The temperature was dropping. Marcus could feel it in his bones, literally, in a way he never could before. When you lived on the streets, your body became a weather station, hyper-attuned to every shift in wind direction, every degree of temperature change. Rain was coming. He could smell it in the air, that particular metallic scent that promised a miserable night ahead. He needed to find shelter before dark. The Mission on 5th Street sometimes had beds available, but you had to get there early. The last time he'd shown up at 9 p.m., the intake worker had looked at him with that particular blend of pity and professional detachment that made him want to scream, and told him they were full. He'd spent that night under an overpass, listening to the rain hammer against concrete while water pooled around his cardboard mat. But moving required energy he wasn't sure he had. His body felt heavy, weighed down by more than just hunger and exhaustion. It was the weight of memory, of regret, of 3 years spent trying to understand how everything had unraveled so completely. 3 years ago, Marcus Sullivan was on top of the world. His company, Tech Vault Solutions, had just been valued at $50 million. He had a mansion in Beverly Hills with a pool that cost more than most houses. He drove a Mercedes S-Class that purred like a satisfied cat. He had a wife who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, a daughter who went to the best private school in California, and a future that seemed limitless. Then, in the space of 6 months, it all disappeared. Not slowly. Not gradually. Like a building demolished in a controlled explosion, standing one moment, dust the next. Marcus closed his eyes, but that was a mistake. Behind his eyelids, he could see it all too clearly, the marble lobby of Tech Vault's headquarters, the receptionist's smile, the way people would straighten up when he walked past, the respect in their voices when they said, "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan." He could hear the click of his Italian leather shoes on polished floors, feel the weight of his briefcase, smell the expensive cologne he wore without thinking about the price. He opened his eyes quickly, forcing himself back to the present. The alley. The cold brick. The distant sound of traffic. This was his reality now. A rat scurried past, barely 3 feet away, completely unbothered by his presence. Marcus watched it disappear into a pile of garbage bags and felt a kinship with the creature that would have disgusted his former self. They were both survivors, both searching for scraps in a city that had no use for them. His stomach growled, a hollow sound that seemed too loud in the narrow alley. When was the last time he'd eaten? Yesterday, maybe. A half-eaten sandwich someone had left on a bench in Pershing Square. Before that, soup at the church on 3rd Street. The nuns there didn't ask questions, didn't make you sit through a sermon before they'd feed you. They just ladled out the soup and handed you bread and looked at you like you were human. That was becoming increasingly rare, being looked at like he was human. Marcus had learned that homelessness was a kind of invisibility. People's eyes would land on him for a fraction of a second, just long enough for their brains to categorize and dismiss, then slide away as if he'd never existed. He could be dying right here against this wall, and 100 people would step over him on their way to wherever people with homes and jobs and futures went. Sometimes he tested it. He'd make eye contact deliberately, hold someone's gaze, see how long it took them to look away. The record was maybe 2 seconds. Usually less. Sometimes people would give him money, fishing out crumpled bills with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times before, but even then, they wouldn't really see him. He was just a charitable tax write-off with a pulse, a momentary discomfort to be resolved with cash. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of exhaust fumes and fried food from a restaurant somewhere nearby. Marcus's stomach clenched. He could picture it so clearly, a plate of hot food, steam rising, the simple pleasure of eating something that hadn't been salvaged from a trash can or served from an industrial-sized pot by well-meaning volunteers. He used to eat at Spago, at Cut, at Providence. He'd think nothing of dropping $300 on a single meal, more on wine. He'd had a regular table at Matsuhisa, where the chef knew his order by heart. Now, the thought of those meals seemed almost obscene, a level of excess that belonged to a different person entirely. Because that's what it felt like Marcus Sullivan, CEO, and Marcus Sullivan, homeless man, were two completely different people. Sometimes he'd see his reflection in a store window and genuinely not recognize himself. The man staring back had hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, a beard that had gone from fashionably stubbly to genuinely unkempt, hair that stuck up in directions gravity shouldn't allow. 3 years on the streets had aged him in ways that went beyond simple years. He looked 50, maybe older. His hands, which used to be smooth and manicured, were now cracked and dirty, the nails broken and rimmed with grime he couldn't quite scrub away even when he managed to use a public restroom sink. His daughter wouldn't recognize him. That thought hit him like a physical blow, the way it always did. Rebecca was 12 now, no, 13. Her birthday had been 2 months ago. October 15th. She'd be 13, starting to care about boys and music and all the things teenage girls cared about, and he'd missed it. He'd missed everything. The last time he'd seen her, she was 10. Still young enough to hug him without self-consciousness, still willing to hold his hand in public. They'd been at the house, the mansion, really, though they'd never called it that, and she'd been showing him something on her phone, some video of a cat doing something supposedly hilarious. He'd only half paid attention, his mind already on a conference call scheduled for later that evening. If he'd known it was the last time, would he have paid more attention? Would he have held on longer when she hugged him goodbye? Would he have told her he loved her, really told her, instead of that distracted, "Love you too, sweetheart," he'd tossed over his shoulder on his way to his office? Probably not. That was the thing about life, you never knew which moments were the last ones until it was too late to do anything about it. Marcus shifted his weight, trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache. The brick wall was unforgiving, but it was better than lying down on the concrete. You had to be careful about lying down in public. It made you vulnerable, made you a target. He'd learned that the hard way, waking up one morning to find someone had gone through his pockets while he slept, taking the $17 he'd panhandled over 3 days. $17. Once upon a time, he wouldn't have bent down to pick up $17 if it had been lying on the sidewalk. Now it represented the difference between eating and not eating, between a bed at the Mission and another night under the stars. The sky was darker now, that brief window of twilight giving way to proper night. Lights were coming on in the buildings around him, hundreds of windows glowing yellow and warm, each one representing a life he could barely imagine anymore. People coming home from work, heating up dinner, settling in front of TVs, complaining about bosses and traffic and things that seemed impossibly trivial from where Marcus sat. He needed to move. Sitting here wasn't accomplishing anything except making him colder and more depressed. The Mission was a 20-minute walk from here, if he could muster the energy. 20 minutes that would take him past his old office building, a route he traveled thousands of times in a very different vehicle. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting with a series of cracks and pops that sounded like bubble wrap. His left knee was bad, had been for 6 months, ever since he'd fallen during a rainstorm and landed wrong. It should probably be looked at by a doctor, but free clinics had waiting lists months long, and emergency rooms would treat him and send him a bill he could never pay, adding to the mountain of debt that already existed somewhere in databases and filing cabinets, attached to a name that used to mean something. He started walking, each step a small act of will. Past the dumpster where he sometimes found salvageable food. Past the spot where Jimmy usually set up his shopping cart full of belongings, though Jimmy wasn't there tonight, probably already made it to the Mission. Past the place where the alley opened onto Broadway, where the street lights were brighter and the foot traffic picked up and Marcus had to steel himself for the casual cruelty of being invisible in a crowd. The walk took him through the heart of downtown, past buildings he'd once entered through the front door with his head held high. Now he skirted around their edges, keeping to the shadows, another ghost haunting the city's margins. And there it was, the building that used to house TechVault Solutions. 40 stories of glass and steel, beautiful in the way modern architecture could be when money was no object. The lobby was still visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, all polished marble and contemporary art, a fountain in the center that cost more than most people's houses. Marcus stopped across the street, something he told himself he wouldn't do anymore but always did anyway. He could see people moving through the lobby, their purposes clear in their confident strides. Workers heading home for the evening, security guards making their rounds, probably a couple having an argument near the elevator bank. He could see their gestures even from this distance, animated and intense. Floor 37. That's where his office had been. Corner office, naturally. 2 walls of windows offering a view that made visitors literally gasp. He'd taken it for granted, the way you take everything for granted when you have too much. Sometimes he'd go entire weeks without actually looking at the view, too focused on spreadsheets and contracts and the 1,000 small decisions that had seemed so crucial at the time. If he squinted, he could almost see it, the mahogany desk he'd special ordered from Italy, the leather chair that had cost $8,000 and felt like sitting on a cloud, the bar cart in the corner stocked with bottles that cost more per ounce than most people spent on groceries. All of it gone now, sold off to pay creditors, or maybe just thrown away when the company folded and new tenants moved in. Did they keep any of it? Did someone else sit at his desk now, making decisions about their company, their future, completely unaware of the ghost that had occupied that space before them? Or had they gutted the whole floor, erased every trace of TechVault like it had never existed? Marcus forced himself to keep walking. Standing here was dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. It was too easy to get lost in the past, to stand on this corner until security noticed and moved him along, another vagrant making the wealthy tenants uncomfortable. The Mission was still 10 minutes away. He could make it. 1 foot in front of the other, the fundamental skill that had gotten him through 3 years of this life. Don't think about the big picture. Don't think about how he'd gotten here or how he'd ever get out. Just think about the next step, the next meal, the next place to sleep. But as he walked, Marcus couldn't help wondering, if someone had told him 3 years ago that this was his future, would he have believed them? Would he have done anything differently? Or was this ending written in invisible ink from the very beginning, waiting for the right conditions to become visible? The rain started just as he reached 4th Street. Light at first, just a mist that clung to his face and clothes, but he could feel the promise of more in the heavy clouds overhead. He quickened his pace as much as his protesting body would allow. By the time he reached the Mission, he was soaked through, water running down his face and dripping from his beard. There was a line outside, there was always a line, but it wasn't too long yet. Maybe 20 people, all with that same hunched, defeated posture that Marcus recognized from his own reflection. He took his place at the end of the line and waited. And while he waited, water pooling in his shoes and running down his back, Marcus Sullivan, who once commanded boardrooms and signed million-dollar contracts, did something he hadn't allowed himself to do in a very long time. He thought about how he'd ended up here. Really thought about it. Not the sanitized version he'd been telling himself, where he was just a victim of circumstance and bad luck. The real version. The one that started with a man who had everything and wasn't satisfied. A man who wanted more, always more, and made one decision, one single, catastrophic decision, that brought his entire empire crashing down around him. And as the rain fell harder and the line shuffled forward, Marcus realized something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He was about to relive it all. Not by choice, but because that's what happens when you're left alone with nothing but time and regret. The memories were coming whether he wanted them or not, as inevitable as the storm that was now drenching the city. The fall hadn't started 3 years ago when he lost everything. It had started much earlier, in a marble office on the 37th floor, when a man who should have known better decided that 50 million wasn't enough. You're absolutely right, I apologize for the count error. Let me verify, part 1 was indeed 2,818 words, not 1,607. I'll be much more careful with word counts going forward. Since part 1 is already complete at 2,818 words, well above the 1,600 minimum, let me now proceed to part 2, the empire he built, targeting 1,600 to 1,800 words to balance the total structure. The empire he built. The Mission gave him a bed that night, a thin mattress on a metal frame in a room with 40 other men. The smell was what always hit him first, unwashed bodies, old clothes, disinfectant fighting a losing battle against decay. Marcus lay on his back, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the symphony of snores and coughs and muttered sleep talk that filled the darkness. Sleep wouldn't come. It rarely did anymore. Instead, his mind pulled him backward, through the years, past the fall and into the time before. When everything was possible. When Marcus Sullivan wasn't just a name, but a brand, a promise, a force. It started in a garage. Wasn't that how all the great tech stories began? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, now Marcus Sullivan. Except Marcus's garage was actually a converted pool house behind a rental in Pasadena, and his co-founder wasn't a brilliant programmer but his college roommate who'd agreed to help in exchange for equity he didn't believe would ever be worth anything. That was 2008. Marcus was 29 years old, working a soul-crushing job at a mid-tier consulting firm, and convinced he was smarter than everyone around him. That conviction, that absolute certainty that he saw angles others missed, was both his greatest asset and, eventually, his fatal flaw. The idea was simple: enterprise-level data security for mid-sized companies. Everyone was focused on either massive corporations or individual consumers, but Marcus saw the gap. Thousands of companies too small for the big players to bother with, too large to trust consumer-grade protection. They had money and they had fear, and Marcus had a solution. Tech Vault Solutions. The name came to him at 3 in the morning after his 7th coffee, and it was perfect. Solid. Trustworthy. The kind of name that would look good on contracts and invoices. The first year, they made $73,000 in revenue. Most of it went to keeping the lights on and paying the developers Marcus had convinced to work for equity and prayer. He was living on ramen and ambition, sleeping 4 hours a night, cold calling companies during the day and coding at night even though he wasn't really a coder. Jennifer thought he was crazy. They'd been dating for 2 years, and she wanted stability, a real job, a real apartment, maybe an engagement ring. Instead, Marcus gave her spreadsheets and promises and asked her to believe in something that existed mostly in his head. "It's going to work," he'd tell her, over cheap takeout in his apartment. "I can see it. 2 years, maybe 3, and we'll be huge." She'd smile that patient smile that meant she loved him but didn't quite believe him. That smile would change later, would become genuine, would light up rooms when she told people at parties that yes, her husband founded Tech Vault, weren't they doing amazing things? But that was later. In 2009, they landed their first major client, a pharmaceutical company in San Diego with $40 million in annual revenue and a terror of data breaches. The contract was worth $200,000. Marcus remembered the moment he saw the signed agreement, the way his hands shook as he held the paper. This was real. This was happening. He hired 5 more people. Moved the operation out of the pool house and into actual office space in Glendale. Nothing fancy, fluorescent lights and second-hand furniture, but it had a sign on the door with the company name, and that meant something. Jennifer said yes to the engagement ring he bought with his first real paycheck. They got married in a small ceremony in Santa Barbara, her in a dress that cost more than he'd spent on food the entire previous year, him in a rented tux trying to believe he deserved this happiness. The growth was exponential. Word spread. Tech Vault became known as the company that actually gave a damn about mid-sized clients, that returned calls, that treated a $1 million contract with the same attention as a $10 million one. Marcus's approach was personal. He'd take potential clients to lunch, learn their kids' names, remember their golf handicaps. He made them feel seen in an industry that usually made them feel small. By 2011, they had 30 employees and offices in 3 cities. Revenue hit $8 million. Marcus bought his first luxury car, a BMW 7 Series that felt like driving a spaceship after years of his beat-up Honda. He'd sit in the parking garage sometimes, just looking at it, running his hands over the leather steering wheel, trying to reconcile this reality with the kid who'd eaten ramen for dinner 6 nights a week. Jennifer was pregnant. They bought a house in Pasadena, nothing crazy, just a nice 4-bedroom with a yard and good schools nearby. Marcus would stand in the empty nursery, paint samples in hand, and think about the future he was building. Not just for himself, but for this child who didn't exist yet, who would grow up never knowing what it was like to struggle. Rebecca was born in March 2012, 6 pounds 8 ounces, with Jennifer's eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin. He held her in the hospital, this impossibly tiny human, and made promises he meant with every fiber of his being. She'd have everything. The best schools, the best opportunities, a father who was present and engaged and never too busy. Some of those promises he kept. Others got lost somewhere along the way. The company kept growing. By 2014, Tech Vault had 120 employees, offices in 7 cities, and revenue approaching $40 million. They weren't huge by Silicon Valley standards, but they were profitable, stable, respected. Marcus had become exactly what he'd dreamed of, a CEO who mattered, whose opinion was sought, who got invited to speak at conferences and quoted in industry publications. He moved his family to Beverly Hills. The house cost $6 million, which seemed insane until the realtor showed him comparable properties going for $8, $9, $12 million. It had 6 bedrooms, a pool, a 3-car garage, and a view that made Jennifer cry the first time she saw it. "Is this real?" she'd asked, standing in the master bedroom, looking out over the city. "Is this really our life?" This is just the beginning, Marcus had told her, and he'd believed it. The Marble office came in 2015. TechVault moved its headquarters to downtown Los Angeles, taking up 3 floors in a building that smelled like new money and old power. Marcus's office was a corner suite on the 37th floor, all glass and chrome and leather. He'd stand at the window, hands in his pockets, surveying his domain like a king surveying his kingdom. David Chen became CFO that year. Brilliant with numbers, MIT educated, 5 years younger than Marcus but sharp as hell. They'd met at a conference, hit it off over scotch at the hotel bar, and Marcus had offered him the job before the weekend was over. David brought structure to the chaos, systems to the gut feel decisions that had gotten them this far. "You're building something special here," David told him once, late at night in the office, both of them too wired on coffee and ambition to go home. "But special doesn't scale. We need processes. Procedures. Protection." Marcus had laughed. "Protection from what?" "We're doing great." "From success," David had said. "Success makes you a target." He should have listened more carefully to that. The valuation came in 2016. $50 million. A venture capital firm out of San Francisco had been circling, making overtures, and finally they'd commissioned a formal valuation. $50 million. Marcus remembered the conference call where they delivered the news, the way his heart had hammered in his chest, the way he'd had to mute his line for a moment because he didn't trust his voice. $50 million. For a company he'd started in a pool house with $73,000 in revenue. The American dream, quantified in a number so large it didn't feel real. He took Jennifer out that night, to Spago, her favorite. Ordered the most expensive champagne on the menu. Held her hand across the table and told her they'd made it. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said, and meant it. Back then, she still meant it. Rebecca was 4, already showing signs of the smart, curious girl she'd become. Marcus missed her bedtime that night, and most nights, if he was honest. Building an empire required sacrifice. That's what he told himself. That's what all the successful people said. You can't have it all, so you choose where to focus your energy. He chose the company. He'd have time for family later, when things were more stable, when the business ran itself. Later turned into a promise that never quite materialized. The VC firm wanted in. They offered $30 million for a 60% stake. Marcus said no, not because the math was bad, but because he wasn't ready to give up control. TechVault was his baby, his creation, and the thought of answering to a board felt like betrayal. "We don't need them," he told David. "We're profitable. We're growing. Why give up equity when we can do this ourselves?" David had looked at him across the conference table, his expression unreadable. Sometimes the smart move is taking money when it's offered. Markets change. Opportunities close. "Then we'll make new opportunities," Marcus had said, with the confidence of a man who'd never really failed at anything that mattered. Pride. That's what it was, though he couldn't see it then. Pride dressed up as business acumen, as vision, as leadership. He was Marcus Sullivan, the man who'd built a $50 million company from nothing. What did VCs know that he didn't? Everything, it turned out. But that revelation was still a year away. In 2017, TechVault was at its peak. 200 employees. $60 million in revenue. Clients across North America. Marcus was flying first class, staying in 5-star hotels, wearing watches that cost more than cars. He had a driver, an assistant, a wine cellar in his house that was temperature controlled to the exact degree. He also had less time for Jennifer, less patience for Rebecca's questions, less awareness of the small cracks forming in the foundation of everything he'd built. The empire was at its zenith. Marcus Sullivan stood at the center of his success, master of his universe, convinced that the only direction was up. He couldn't see the cliff edge he was walking toward. Nobody ever can when they're that high up. The fall, when it came, wouldn't be gradual. It would be spectacular. Complete. The kind of collapse that people would talk about for years, that would become a cautionary tale in business schools. But first, there was one more decision to make. One opportunity that seemed too good to pass up. One moment where Marcus's ambition would outpace his judgment, where his need for more would override every warning sign. That moment was coming. And when it arrived, Marcus Sullivan would make the choice that would destroy everything. The collapse. The opportunity came in the form of an email. Marcus almost deleted it. His inbox received hundreds of pitches every week, partnerships, acquisitions, investment schemes that ranged from legitimate to laughably fraudulent. His assistant filtered most of them, but occasionally something slipped through that seemed worth a second glance. This one came from a company called Sentinel Analytics, based in Austin. They developed AI-driven threat detection software that they claimed was years ahead of anything on the market. Revolutionary technology. Game-changing. All the buzzwords that usually made Marcus roll his eyes. But the demo was impressive. Really impressive. Marcus flew to Austin on a Tuesday, met with their CEO in a sleek office that tried too hard to look like Silicon Valley. The technology worked exactly as advertised, maybe better. It could predict security breaches before they happened, identify vulnerabilities that human analysts missed, adapt in real time to emerging threats. "Why are you talking to me?" Marcus had asked. "This is big boy stuff. You should be pitching to Google, Microsoft, the major players." The CEO, a nervous guy named Brandon with a startup founder's uniform of hoodie and expensive sneakers, had smiled. "We want a partner, not a parent company. Someone who understands the mid-market, who has the relationships we don't. Someone like TechVault." The deal was simple. TechVault would acquire Sentinel for $25 million, $15 million cash, $10 million in TechVault stock. They'd integrate the technology into their existing platform, charging premium prices to clients who wanted cutting-edge protection. The projections showed TechVault's valuation potentially doubling within 18 months. Marcus flew back to Los Angeles with his mind racing. This was it. The move that would take them from successful to dominant. From 50 million to 100 million, maybe more. This was how you built a real empire. David Chen hated the idea immediately. "We don't have 15 million in cash lying around," he said, standing in Marcus's office, his usual calm replaced with something harder. "We'd have to take on debt. Significant debt." "Debt is leverage," Marcus countered, repeating something he'd heard at a conference. "Every major company uses debt to grow. Smart companies use debt strategically. This is," David paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is betting the company on technology we don't fully understand, from a startup that's been around for 3 years. What's their due diligence look like? What are their retention rates? Who else has validated this tech?" Marcus had shrugged off the concerns. He'd done his research. Well, some research. Enough research. The technology worked. He'd seen it with his own eyes. "Sometimes you have to trust your gut," he'd told David. "My gut built this company. My gut got us to 50 million. My gut says this is the move." What Marcus's gut didn't account for was that Sentinel Analytics was smoke and mirrors held together with venture capital and prayer. The acquisition closed in June 2017. Marcus signed the papers in that same marble office, his Mont Blanc pen gliding across pages of legal text he'd barely read. Lawyers had reviewed everything, given their blessing. The board, which was really just Marcus, David, and 2 investors who rarely disagreed with Marcus, had approved it. 15 million in cash, borrowed from 3 different banks at interest rates that made David physically wince. 10 million in TechVault stock, diluting existing shareholders, but who cared when the company was about to explode in value? The press release went out that afternoon. Tech Vault acquires Sentinel Analytics in strategic move to revolutionize data security. Marcus did 3 podcast interviews, a piece in TechCrunch, got quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Jennifer threw a party at the house, 200 people drinking champagne by the pool, everyone congratulating Marcus on his vision, his boldness, his inevitable success. He'd stood on the terrace that night, Rebecca asleep upstairs, Jennifer laughing with friends by the bar, and felt like a god. This was the moment. This was when Marcus Sullivan became a name people would remember. The technology integration started in July. That's when the problems began. Sentinel's code was a mess. Not just complicated, actively broken in ways that became apparent the moment TechVault's engineers tried to incorporate it into their existing systems. Features that had worked flawlessly in demos failed in real-world applications. The AI that was supposed to be revolutionary kept throwing false positives, flagging legitimate activity as threats, missing actual vulnerabilities. It's like they built it specifically for the demo, one of Marcus's senior developers told him in August, exhausted from 3 weeks of 18-hour days. Everything else is held together with duct tape and hope. Marcus had them keep trying. Throw more resources at it. Hire more developers. This was just normal integration friction, the kind of thing that happened with any acquisition. They'd figure it out. They didn't figure it out. By September, TechVault had spent an additional $3 million trying to fix Sentinel's technology. Clients who'd been promised the revolutionary new features were getting angry. Contracts were being delayed. A few smaller clients left entirely, tired of excuses. David came to Marcus's office in October with a folder full of numbers that painted a picture Marcus didn't want to see. "We're burning through cash," David said, his voice flat. "The debt payments are killing us. Revenue is down because we've been too focused on integration to service existing clients properly. And the Sentinel tech still doesn't work." "It will work," Marcus insisted. "We just need more time." "We don't have more time. We have maybe 6 months of runway at this burn rate. We need to cut costs, restructure the debt, maybe lay off the Sentinel team and write off the acquisition." Marcus had refused. Admitting failure wasn't in his vocabulary. He'd made this call, bet the company on it, and he wasn't going to back down now. Winners doubled down. Winners pushed through adversity. Winners didn't quit when things got hard. So he kept pushing. Borrowed more money. Made promises to clients he wasn't sure he could keep. Told his leadership team that everything was fine, just growing pains, just the cost of innovation. Jennifer started asking questions he didn't want to answer. How much had they really spent? Why was he always at the office? Why did he seem so stressed? Marcus told her not to worry about it, this was just business, she wouldn't understand the complexities. The distance between them, which had been growing for years, became a canyon. By December, 3 major clients had canceled their contracts. Word was spreading in the industry, TechVault had overextended, made a bad acquisition, was struggling. Competitors who'd once respected Marcus started circling like sharks who'd smelled blood. Then, in January 2018, the lawsuit hit. 2 of Sentinel's original investors claimed they'd been defrauded in the sale. They sued Sentinel, sued TechVault, sued Marcus personally. The allegations were devastating. Sentinel had knowingly misrepresented their technology, inflated their metrics, hidden serious flaws from due diligence. And TechVault, they claimed, should have known. Should have looked harder. Should have done real due diligence instead of falling for a dog and pony show. Marcus hired lawyers he couldn't afford to fight allegations that were probably true. The legal bills alone were crushing, $100,000 a month, then $200,000, then more. Discovery revealed what Marcus had been too blinded by ambition to see. Sentinel had been a house of cards, and he'd paid $25 million for it. Clients left in droves. Nobody wanted to work with a company that was bleeding money and fighting lawsuits. Employees started updating their LinkedIn profiles, taking calls from recruiters, jumping ship before the whole thing sank. David Chen came to Marcus in March with a recommendation that felt like a knife to the chest: file for bankruptcy. Restructure. Save what could be saved. We can't, Marcus said. If we file, I lose everything. The house is collateral on one of the loans. My personal assets are tied up in this. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you bet everything on a company you didn't properly vet, David said, and there was something in his voice that Marcus had never heard before. Contempt. That's when Marcus learned the second devastating truth: David had been talking to investors, planning a potential takeover. A way to save TechVault by removing Marcus from the equation. The betrayal was total. His CFO, his friend, the man he'd trusted with the company's finances, was planning a coup. Marcus fired him on the spot. Watched security escort David out of the building with his box of personal items, the same walk of shame Marcus had seen happen to others but never imagined would touch his inner circle. It was the wrong move. David knew where all the bodies were buried, knew every financial weakness, every mistake Marcus had made. Within a week, he'd gone to the remaining investors with a complete picture of TechVault's collapse, and they'd forced an emergency board meeting. Marcus walked into that conference room in April 2018 thinking he could save his company. Walked out an hour later with nothing. The board voted to remove him as CEO. Effective immediately. They'd bring in outside management, try to salvage what was left, probably sell the company for parts. Marcus would retain his shares, worthless now, but technically his, but would have no role in the company he'd founded, no say in its future. He'd built TechVault from nothing. And in less than a year, he'd destroyed it. The banks came for the house in June. Marcus had 90 days to vacate. He walked through the empty rooms. Jennifer had already moved out, taken Rebecca to her parents' place in San Diego, filed for divorce through a lawyer who made it clear she wanted nothing from Marcus except distance, and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe this was permanent. Everything was being sold. The cars, the furniture, the art on the walls, the wine in the temperature-controlled cellar. All of it liquidated to pay debts that still wouldn't be fully covered. Marcus's personal bankruptcy filing was 140 pages long. Assets, essentially zero. Liabilities, $14 million. He moved into a cheap apartment in Koreatown, the kind of place with thin walls and questionable plumbing and a view of a parking lot. His phone rang constantly: creditors, lawyers, former colleagues with questions he couldn't answer. Eventually, he stopped answering. Jennifer's divorce lawyer was efficient. Marcus didn't fight it. What was there to fight for? He had nothing to offer, nothing to bargain with. She got full custody of Rebecca, which was probably for the best. What kind of father could he be now? The last time he saw his daughter was in September 2018, at a Starbucks halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. Jennifer waited in the car while Rebecca sat across from him, 12 years old and looking at him like he was a stranger. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she'd asked, and the genuine concern in her voice had broken something in him that hadn't quite broken yet. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." It was the last lie he told her. After that visit, Jennifer's lawyer sent a letter requesting no further contact. It was too confusing for Rebecca, too painful. Marcus could have fought it, could have demanded his parental rights, but he didn't. Maybe she was better off thinking he'd abandoned her than knowing the truth about what he'd become. The money ran out in November. The apartment went first, then the car, then everything else. Marcus found himself in a motel on the edge of the city, paying by the week, watching his bank account drop to zero and then into overdraft. By December, he was on the street. It happened faster than he would have thought possible. One week you have a roof over your head, the next you're sleeping in your car. One week you have a car, the next you're sleeping in a park. One week you have a backpack with your belongings, the next someone steals it while you're using a public restroom. Marcus Sullivan, who'd once commanded a $50 million empire, who'd signed deals in marble offices and driven cars that cost more than houses, was homeless. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that he had nobody to blame but himself. Not David Chen, who'd tried to warn him. Not Sentinel Analytics, who'd lied but who Marcus should have seen through. Not the banks, or the lawyers, or the investors, or the market. Just himself. His arrogance. His certainty that he was smarter than everyone else. His refusal to listen to warnings because he thought his gut was infallible. One decision. One acquisition. One moment of ego-driven certainty. That's all it took to lose everything. The streets. 3 years. That's how long Marcus had been living on the streets of Los Angeles when he woke up on a Tuesday morning in December 2021 and realized he couldn't remember what day Rebecca's birthday was. He sat up on his cardboard mat under the overpass, panic tightening his chest. October something. October 15th? 16th? The date that had once been circled on every calendar, planned for weeks in advance, celebrated with parties and presents and cake, gone. Erased by 3 years of survival that left no room for memories that served no purpose. That's when Marcus understood how far he'd fallen. Not when he lost the company, or the house, or his family. But when he lost the basic pieces of himself that made him human. The streets had taught him things no boardroom ever could. How to tell which dumpsters had edible food and which would make you sick. How to read weather patterns in the way the wind shifted. How to sleep with one eye open. How to make yourself small and invisible when necessary, how to hold someone's gaze when you needed them to see you as human instead of scenery. He'd learned the geography of homelessness, where the good soup kitchens were, which alleys the police didn't check, which neighborhoods would call the cops just for existing while poor. He knew the names of other street dwellers, their stories, their territories. Jimmy with the shopping cart. Rosa, who used to be a nurse. Carlos, who claimed he'd been a Marine but Marcus suspected was lying. They were his community now. The only people who looked at him and saw a person instead of a problem. Marcus had tried, in the beginning, to climb back out. He'd applied for jobs, dishwasher, janitor, anything that would hire someone with his resume gap and no permanent address. But employers wanted references, background checks, proof of reliability that he couldn't provide. His name, once an asset, was now a liability. A Google search revealed the lawsuits, the bankruptcy, the spectacular failure. Nobody wanted to hire Marcus Sullivan. So he'd stopped being Marcus Sullivan, at least in any way that mattered. He became just Marcus, another face in the crowd of invisible people, another ghost haunting the city's margins. The isolation was worse than the hunger. Worse than the cold. Worse than the constant fear and exhaustion. Marcus could go days without having a real conversation, weeks without hearing his own name spoken aloud. He'd become a phantom, present but not seen, alive but not living. Sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Marcus would let himself remember. Not the fall, he'd relived that enough times to have it memorized, but the before. Rebecca's laugh. Jennifer's smile back when it was real. The weight of a pen signing a contract. The view from the 37th floor. Those memories hurt worse than any physical pain the streets had inflicted. But on this particular December morning, something was different. Marcus walked to the Mission for breakfast, stood in line with 40 other people, received his tray of scrambled eggs and toast. He sat at a long table, eating mechanically, when he noticed the man across from him reading a newspaper someone had left behind. The headline was about tech acquisitions. Some startup getting bought for billions. Another success story, another person who'd made the right call at the right time. Marcus stared at that headline for a long time. And then, for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than regret and shame. He felt curiosity. What if he tried again? Not to build another empire, he'd learned that lesson. But something. Anything. What if he stopped defining himself by what he'd lost and started thinking about what might still be possible? It was a fragile thought, barely more than a whisper. But it was there. Marcus finished his breakfast, walked out into the December morning, and instead of heading to his usual spot, he went to the public library. He hadn't been inside a building like this in months. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of books and computers and possibility. He sat at a computer terminal, his hands shaking slightly, and opened a browser. 3 years on the streets hadn't killed him. Maybe that meant something. Maybe there was a reason he was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling hope even when logic said hope was stupid. Marcus typed "free job training programs Los Angeles" into the search bar. The results filled the screen. He still lived on the streets. He still had nothing. He was still haunted by the empire he'd built and destroyed, still missed his daughter with an ache that never quite faded, still carried the weight of every mistake he'd made. But for the first time in years, Marcus Sullivan felt something that almost resembled hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start.